Today we're going to explain exactly what is mysterious about the problem of evil and Christian defenses and theodicies which seek to resolve this particular problem. Here we go. I was never really bothered by the problem of evil until in the same 3-month period. If you're a Self-Wire listener, you know this story. Same 3-month period. My dad died. My girlfriend broke up with me. I was like publicly humiliated in a couple of different situations. I won't get into the details of it, but I lost my community, my dignity, my heart, and my dad all at the same time. And I felt absolutely crushed. And I took for granted the basic architecture of my well-being, and I believed that God had deprived me of something that I deserved. And if he hadn't deprived me, then what use was he exactly? And it was at this time that I decided to change the focus of my doctoral studies from Trinitarian theology to traumatic theology, an exegetically informed philosophical investigation of the negative experience of God or God's relationship to traumatic events. And Theodicy was a central component of this investigation. And what exactly is mysterious about this doctrine is difficult to articulate, but it has been for me an elusive and unfathomable dilemma for my own belief in God that continues to hold open a wound over which God and I are still fighting. So here are the contours of the Theodicy mystery. And while I could admire this discussion with, academic references and footnotes and block quotes and all that stuff, I will keep it conceptual for the sake of straightforwardness and clarity, for the sake of listeners, okay? I'm not going to mire it with a bunch of names and a bunch of block quotes, okay? My dissertation is being published soon with Fortress Academic, and you can read much more prolonged examinations of these ideas in that dissertation when it's released. So, I hope that this minimalist approach to theodicy will be refreshing for those who feel that the problem of evil is often lost among academics. And I've heard too many professional theologians glibly say, well, it's complicated. Well, no, it's not. It can be explained in a very straightforward manner, okay? If I had the power to stop a little girl from getting raped, I would stop that person from doing that. God has that preventative power. Yet these events still occur. What's his reason? We must never lose sight of the gravity or difficulty of the theodicy question. One theologian put it very well when he said that any theologian who proposes a defense or a theodicy to resolve the problem of evil should imagine that he is looking into the eyes of a small Jewish girl in a Nazi concentration camp before she enters the ovens, because that is the sort of evil for which he claims to give an account. And I think there's something accurate about that. Too many theodicies are conceived between the cement walls of evangelical seminaries, incentivized by a professor's salary and a 401k that pushes evangelical scholars to put the suffering of the world in a box and tie a nice logical bow around it because that's the evangelical script. And on the other hand, because we want to reject people just writing off the problem of evil, and it's a heinous optimism, right, or a cruel optimism, as one philosopher put it. And on the other hand, it's just as insulting to the suffering to say, as the progressive left-leaning Christians say, well, theodicy is mysterious and we can just never get a solution. We'll just trust God. It's very hard. Like lots of progressive postmodern Christians will champion the mysteriousness of the theodicy dilemma as if their moral relativism licenses their limp-wristed and jellyfish theology. And so the sufferer is caught between the horns of the theodicy of the cold, disinterested academic who seeks to just resolve the issue and logically put it in a box and put it away, and sort of the white chick leftist blogger who says that Christians don't even really need a theodicy because, divine mystery, right? So, here we're going to explain exactly what the theodicy mystery is and the difficulties which face it, which make it mysterious and oftentimes are left without resolution. So, what is theodicy exactly? Theodicy is, well, now it's an English word, but it's composed of two Greek words, theos and dikaios, meaning God and righteousness, or loosely translated, the attempt to justify God. Okay, theodicy is the attempt to justify God. So if God is all-powerful, how can he stand by while evil is perpetrated? And in terms of legal culpability, options for classifying God's relation to evil can be classified on a spectrum. On the one side of the spectrum is the Calvinist, who proposes that God controls all things. So Calvin argues, for instance, that God ordained and willed every single evil in the world, every single rape, every single Holocaust, everything. And according to John Piper and philosopher Gottfried Leibniz before him, God's reason for allowing every single evil is that he intends to bring a greater good out of this evil. And that greater good, which he intends to bring out of that evil, serves as his justification for ordaining that it should happen. And this position, which we will call the Reformed position, utilizes the distinction between the decretal will of God and the permissive will of God, which posits that God's relationship to evil is not proactive. He doesn't decree it through his decretive will. He doesn't say, that shall happen, this shall happen according to my will. But rather, it's passive. He doesn't decree it, he permits it. So it's passive. Namely, God's relationship to evil is one in which he is passive. Namely, it's as a way of positing that even though God ordains the evil, he ordains it indirectly through evil agents and not directly in order to protect the holiness of God. So that's the Reformed position, right? On the other end of the spectrum is what we will call the free will position, constituted by open theists and Arminians who argue that evil exists in the world because God decided to roll the dice by giving human beings free will, thus instilling them with the ability to offer genuine love and faith, thereby risking the possibility of worlds in which humans use their free will to sin and create death and destruction. And the fact that our world exists is due ultimately then to human and angelic will and not ultimately to the divine will. And God's defense is essentially that the goodness of free will is always worth whatever evil that free will produces. So that's the Arminian Theodicy. Now, we need to just make a distinction very quickly between these two terms. So there's the problem of evil, which we're trying to solve, right? But we need to make a distinction between a defense for the problem of evil and a theodicy regarding the problem of evil. So we have to, before we survey the shortcomings of both sides of this Calvinist Arminian spectrum, we have to note a distinction between this defense and theodicy. So a defense is a theological argument which defends against a critique of Christian theology in order to demonstrate its incoherence. So somebody comes and says, hey, God can't be moral because yada, 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 premise 1, premise 2, premise 3. A defense says that argument doesn't work. It doesn't actually justify God. It just parries an attack. Okay. Conversely, theodicy does exactly what the word says. It actually seeks to provide a moral justification or explanation for God's permission of evil. So, for example, Alvin Plantinga's argument from free will is a defense against the argument that God is culpable for evil in the world. Whereas he has another, so that's a defense. It's a free will defense, right? It's arguing against the notion that if God is omnipotent, then he's culpable for all evil in the world. Plantinga says, no, not necessarily, because of the factor of libertarian free will. Then there's something called the felix culpa, which means a happy fall, which is basically the argument that Christ's achievement of redemption is the rationale for evil in the world as a theodicy per se. It serves as a justification because the redemption is such a good thing, and it necessarily requires the preexistence of evil because you can't redeem something that isn't fallen. So redemption is such a good and beautiful thing that it makes all the evil in the world worth it, meaning that only through the permission of sin could God achieve this particular quality of intimacy with his people afforded through redemption, which is theoretically richer even than what we might have had with God if sin had never entered the world. Now, first, we're going to delineate the shortcomings of a free will theodicy. So both spectrums of the theodicy dilemma face large difficulties. So in the free will position, there are two initial problems: the problem of divine negligence and the problem of gradational intervention. First, let's tackle the problem of divine negligence. Let's tackle the problem of divine negligence. So let's say that God did give man libertarian freedom in order to give him an opportunity to love God and neighbor and to live in an authentically faithful life rather than a robotic one, right? So he has libertarian free will. And this only loosens the screws, though, of the problem of evil a little bit. So while it does reduce the severity of the problem as it faces Calvinist theology, which we'll get to in a second, since Calvinist theology argues that God controls everything and that human beings don't have libertarian free will because of the strength of God's causal relationship to everything in the world, where Arminians argue that, okay, God does not ordain every instance of evil, but it still leaves two issues unsolved: the global problem of evil and the local problem of evil. So in other words, the free will argument, or the free will theism, the existence of free will doesn't actually per se solve the problem of evil, because it leaves two questions unanswered. One, why didn't God step in after the fall, after human beings exercised free will to sin and create death and destruction? Why didn't God step in after the fall and save humanity before millions of people were raped and murdered throughout the whole course of history, right? Why does God wait so long? And it's like, you look at all of the deaths of history, it's like, well, let's say he comes in one year, and it's like, well, he doesn't come that year. Let's say God comes the next year and puts all things right. Well, then he has to answer for why he waited, right? So that's the global problem of evil in terms of God's waiting, right? Like chronologically, you have to answer for why you didn't immediately step in. And then you have problem number two, which is the local problem of evil, which says, why did God let my dad die at such a young age when he could have revived him? So the global problem of evil sort of abstractly asks the problem of, why has God not yet put all things right? Because every day that goes by, as harm is perpetrated against human beings, God has to answer for why he hasn't come back on that day, and then evil's on that day, and then the evil's on that day, right? And then so sort of the global chronological problem, and then the local problem, which is, why did he let my dad die so young when he could have prolonged his life 20 years? It was within his power. Why didn't he do it? Right? Why does he prolong the lives of some and the lives of others? So one is a problem of chronology, one is a problem of arbitrariness. And free will theism, then, it offers a strong defense in the form of the free will defense, but fails to offer a sufficient theodicy, and therefore fails to resolve the existential propulsion of the theodicy project. So in other words, while libertarian free will may accomplish a lot as far as the free will defense goes, it still faces the problem as Calvinism. It faces the same problem as Calvinism as far as God's negligence goes. Only the free will theist has no access to the Calvinist defenses, since he holds that God doesn't have a causal relationship to the evil. So in that regard, free will theism may in fact be a weaker overall theodicy project than the Calvinist. So God faces a chronological negligence and then a personal negligence, a local negligence, one of arbitrariness, one of prolonging culpability, and one of the culpability of arbitrariness. Why save this person and not that person, right? Second, let's tackle the problem of gradational intervention. What does this mean? This is staged by philosophers as the distinction between the problem of evil and the problem of the slightest toothache. So their request for God to solve the problem of evil, and perhaps therein the problem of suffering, can run into two directions. In response to the local problem of evil, why didn't God prolong my dad's life 20 years when he easily could have? God might say, well, if I saved your father from an early death, then why not save everyone from an early death? And if I save everyone from an early death, why not save them from poverty? And if I save them from poverty, why not save them from the slightest toothache? So there's an argument from gradation there. And the force of the argument is that our expectations for God, which frame our disappointment with him, which we philosophically express in the form of the problem of evil, adjust to the circumstances to which we've become accustomed. But this slightest toothache defense of divine inactivity raises a deeper question about divine inactivity. If God is not active in our lives, what good is he? And if he is active, why does he damn some people to such miserable lives? And everybody says, well, he has a reason, he has a reason, he has a reason. But if you're an Arminian, then you don't posit that God has divine control over everything. If you believe that human beings have libertarian free will, it's the problem of, well, how can God intervene at all? And this particular problem, which plagues both the free will position and the reform position, essentially comes back to the possibility of justifying evil at all. In other words, cosmically conceived, justice requires a culprit. And in any construal of divine omnipotence, God seems to end up as the wizard behind the curtain, no matter how you slice the pie of decree and permission. So even if you have humans with libertarian free will running around committing evil, God still has to answer for why he hasn't intervened at all, right? Does he intervene a little bit? And why does he intervene for those people? And you have to answer these questions without any appeal to divine control. So somehow the omnipotence of God makes him culpable somehow, and yet it's difficult to see how any defense or theodicy could vindicate his moral culpability within the free will theist position. Because it's difficult to say if libertarian free will is the defense against the critique that God is culpable, then you have to maintain that God genuinely doesn't interfere with libertarian free will, because as soon as God begins interfering with libertarian free will, then he has to explain why he hasn't interfered with all libertarian free will from the very beginning. You see, that's the problem. And then if he can't interfere with free will in order to retain his holiness, well, then does he interact with the world at all? In which case, what good is he? Okay, so that's the problem with the free will theist theodicy. People have cast it as a strong position in regards to theodicy, but it's actually quite weak. So now we come to the shortcomings of a Calvinist theodicy. Calvinism casts God's relationship to evil in a qualitatively different manner. Calvin, at least, casts God as controlling by permission even the most heinous evils in the world. So the Calvinist defenses and the theodicies can be reduced to two strategies: the divine author defense and the greatest of all possible worlds theodicy. So first, the divine author argument argues that God is not culpable for God is not culpable for evil, rather, because he does not directly perpetrate the evil, right? So God doesn't actually enact the rape himself, he just ordains it and oversees it. And this is expressed by the Reformed scholastics in terms of the distinction between God's decretive will and his permissive will, which we've already noted. And this distinction instructs that God directly decrees certain events to come to pass, which are good, and indirectly decrees other events to come to pass, which are evil. Now, what is the meaningful separation between a direct decree and an indirect decree? Not too sure about that, but let's grant it for now, right? So in other words, if evil is always perpetrated by a conscious agent, then those conscious agents which do good do so by God's active decree, while those agents which perpetrate evil do so because of a deprivation of their human nature. They are deprived of goodness and therefore act out of a lack of divine activity rather than out of a fullness of divine activity. And here, the divine authorship metaphor comes into play. So Reformed apologists might say, well, God writes the book of evil in the world, but he does not himself perpetrate the evil. And this distinction is what James Anderson at Reformed Theological Seminary calls alpha causation, which is divine authorship, and beta causation, which is human perpetration, meaning that you have beta causation, which are human agents acting things out, and that's one kind of culpability. And then you've got God causing alpha causation, who sustains and oversees and ordains all of the beta causation evil in the world. However, this metaphor of God being the author of the book, which I think is basically what Anderson is saying in terms of alpha causation, that God writes the book, this metaphor on which the whole defense hinges fails the defense terribly when one considers that God is not, if God's the author of the book of evil of the world, then he's not writing a fiction, and he's not writing a retrospective nonfiction. A metaphor which more accurately portrays God's actual relationship to evil in the world that still utilizes the author concept in the Calvinist view is like a script for a pornography film, where God actually authors a script that includes harmful sin that he intends real humans to enact in the real world. That's a better metaphor for God's relationship to evil. And now that better expresses the real situation, the real theodicy dilemma. This is morally problematic and, in fact, compromises the divine authorship defense since Calvin is very insistent that there is no event in the universe, especially evil events, which occur except by God's predestination. So that's the difficulty of the divine authorship metaphor, the divine authorship defense. It doesn't really work because the notion that God is the author of sin that's the whole point of the Westminster Confession, right? He's not the author of sin in the sense that he enacts it, but he's the author of the book in the sense that he decrees and permits what will happen, and yet he's still the author. And if he is the author, then he's culpable to the degree that he intends what he authors to be enacted. Second, the greatest of all possible worlds theodicy, which is utilized by Leibniz and Piper. He calls it, he says we live in the best of all possible worlds. That's his seventh point of Calvinism, I think. And this greatest of all possible worlds theodicy argues by analogy that in the same way that undesirable sufferings in the world are in retrospect seen as desirable because of the ends they caused, then we ought to see all evil through faith that God can bring a net good out of the very evil which occurs. So, for example, let's say you're in a position where you get fired from a job, right? And you think, oh, God, why is this happening? And then you get a better job offer, right? And you say, oh, I'm so glad I got fired from that job because now I'm in this new job in this new city with these new friends and I love it and my life's great and I met my wife and all this stuff, right? So you can look back and say, well, in the same way that in smaller ways we can see how things which seemed undesirable at the time ended up working out for good, we can apply that to bigger realities. So, 3 problems. First, the notion of there being a greatest possible world is a theological falsehood. This theodicy contradicts the Orthodox Christian answer to what philosophers call the omnipotence paradox, which is basically Could God create a stone too big for him to lift? The answer is no, because God cannot contradict himself. And the question is shown to be a farce when it is realized that it's sort of a trick question, because people think that the lifting the stone is the real problematic aspect of the question. But the question is, could God create a stone too big for him to lift? The real question at the heart of the omnipotence paradox is, could God create the stone that God couldn't lift? Not whether or not God could lift it, but could God create a stone that is too heavy for God to lift? That is the illogical act, and that is the question to which the answer is clearly no. Okay? One which God could not and would not perform any more than he could or would contradict himself. For God to create a rock too big for him to lift would be for him to contradict himself. And he cannot do this. So God cannot create a rock too big for him to lift any more than he can, let's say, commit a bald lie. And likewise, there is no such thing as a greatest possible world. God is omnipotent. Therefore, there is no ceiling for the greatness of the world which God could create. Okay, there's no world where God says, then boom, that's greatest. I literally couldn't create a bigger world. Literally couldn't do it. Couldn't create a better world. Just simply could not do it, right? So because God is omnipotent, which is infinite power, there is no ceiling for the greatness of the world which God could create, rendering the possibility of such a thing as the greatest possible world for an infinitely powerful God itself a contradiction in terms and a departure from Christian orthodoxy. Second, certain heinous evils do not have a net good, right? So we think, well, go back to the Leibnizian argument or the Piperian argument for the greatest of all possible worlds. Well, in the same way that I got fired from my one job and now I have a new job, which is really awesome. And by analogy, I can say, well, maybe there are more serious things that happen to me that I don't want, which will create a net benefit. There are certain heinous evils that don't have a net good. Okay, this is otherwise called the theological problem of trauma. Okay, there is no net good for the Holocaust. There is no net good for a little girl being raped. One might contrive a philosophical situation in which one had to choose between one person. Let's come up with a scenario, right? Let's say there's a scenario in which you for some reason are in the situation where you're being forced to choose between one person being raped versus 1,000 people being raped. In which case the single rape was the relative good, right? You're like, okay, well, I'd rather choose the one than the 1,000. But there are two problems with this applied to God. Even if this is conceived as a relative good, it doesn't posit a net good. Okay, so this argument fails to distinguish between what philosophers call the utilitarian good and the inherent good. And the saving of 1,000 lives was the utilitarian good, but it still failed to undo or justify the inherent evil of the one rape, which the saving cost. This leads to the third problem, which is that this theodicy does not, this greatest of all possible worlds theodicy, does not solve the originative problem of evil. So let's take the problem of having to choose between 1,000 people being raped and one person being raped, right? Well, the argument which states that the greatest of all possible worlds necessarily includes the heinous evil of our world silently implies that God was in a Sophie's Choice scenario before he created the world. What does that mean? Well, in the novel Sophie's Choice, which was later made into a movie with Meryl Streep, the protagonist, played by Streep, was sent to a Nazi concentration camp and was forced to choose between the murder of her daughter and the murder of her son. It said, we're going to kill one, you have to choose which one it is. So she chose her son, and she can hardly be blamed for the death of her son, right? That's not something that she did, right? She was put in a bad decision where she had to make that choice, and that sort of philosophically represents the Sophie's Choice scenario. The Calvinist use of this Leibnizian theodicy attempts to apply the same Sophie's Choice justification to God by implying that God was in a similar situation before his free decision to create the world. Of course, if Calvin was right, God's hand wasn't forced in any way, and his free decision to create was not in the context of a Sophie's Choice scenario. God wasn't held at gunpoint before creating the world, saying you have to choose, a world that contains evil. So therefore, the question, why did God allow sin in the world, remains unanswered, and the place of a successful theodicy for Christian theology remains unanswered. And you might say, well, God has his reasons. We don't know why he created a world that allows heinous evil. We just have to trust that it was the best one he could create. Again, goes back to our first problem. Theologically, you can't say there's such thing as a best world that God could create. create. There's no ceiling on divine omnipotence. So that categorically doesn't make sense. Number two, God's still culpable. Again, remember the distinction between utilitarian evil and inherent evil. Even if God has a utilitarian rationale for the evil which he permits, he still is culpable of negligence regarding the inherent evil of those things which he permits, right? Which leads us to this third point, which is that if he doesn't have access to a greatest of all possible world defense theologically, and if he can't account for the inherent evil, if you can't justify the inherent evil of a thing, because there is no justification for permitting an inherent evil at the inherent level, right? Even if there's a utilitarian good, then this issue of why did you have to include evil in the world at all? Well, there's no appeal to a Sophie's choice scenario because God could have created a world without evil, which leaves the question open. How is God good then? How is God good? And before we close, we might comment briefly on the argument from Privation. Now, this is an argument made by Thomas Aquinas, and it's a medieval argument predicated on the notion that evil is actually not a thing for which God needs to be justified, but rather, since God is pure existence, evil is a lack of existence. So therefore, when a human being sins and brings evil into the world, it is not because he is infected with a substance called evil, Thomas argues, or the medievals argue, for which God needs to give an account, but rather that evil is a non-thing, and therefore God can't be culpable for a nothing, essentially a lack. This argument has two problems. First, if God is free of culpability on account of evil being a privation rather than an existing thing, then why wouldn't the humans who perpetrate the privation be vindicated from condemnation also? So in other words, if conceiving of evil as a privation negates divine culpability, it is difficult to see why it would not also negate human culpability, or why it wouldn't vindicate humans also. Second, this argument does not address the fundamental problem of theodicy, which is that God has infinite power to exercise relative to free creatures and therefore to privation also. So if God really is the abundance of being and is pure existence, actus purus as the scholastics called it, then why could he not negate the privation through imbuing humans with a greater abundance of existence and thereby negate the evil? So in answer to this question, the Christian utilizing this defense will either appeal to the free will defense, which has its own shortcomings we've already noted, or will appeal to mystery. And neither fill the gap of a successful Christian theodicy, and God's negligence stands unanswered and unjustified. What has been the point of dismantling these two competing contributions to the Christian theodicy dilemma? Well, it has been to highlight and refresh the Christian appreciation for theological mystery. Too often, evangelical theologians slip into an unjustified rationalism that goes unchallenged by those who have neither the time, the intellect, nor the categories to refute them. And refutation of successful theodicy need not always be a critique of the Christian belief system per se. In fact, because the object of theological knowing is the incomprehensible God, a rationalistic Christianity could use a dose of anti-theodicy against those arguments which truly fail in order to revive our appreciation for the mysteriousness of God. Christians must be open to the possibility that they may not be able to wrap their cognitive arms around the holiness and benevolence of God relative to evil in the world. They just might not be able to do it. And its full and justified form may simply be humanly inexpressible, or at the very least unavailable to the church at this season in our historical moment, just as certain truths which come to light in the Reformation were not fully clear to the early church fathers. Either way, two things can be true at once. One, God is good. Two, the moral logic which constitutes the integrity of God's goodness is unavailable to us for some reason, chronological, logical, perspectival, or otherwise. And this is a difficult tension to leave unresolved, and has pushed many people out of the faith, perhaps more than any other tension in Christian theology. It is literally one of the most lamentable manifestations of Christian mystery, but it nevertheless remains mysterious to us. Is it more than a mystery? Is it, in fact, a contradiction between God's omnipotence and his moral purity? The answer depends on if you're a Christian, and one thing is certainly true. If you are a Christian, it is essential to confess that God is not evil. And yet, his holiness should not dissuade you from complaint and critique. On the contrary, it should compel you to the sort of protest against God taken up by Job and David and many other saints in biblical and church history. God's goodness is not a law against our protest of him, against our lamentation of the things that happen in the world, but is rather the promise that he will hear our protest because he is a righteous judge and will not throw our complaint into the shredder as soon as we stop praying. It would be inappropriate to conclude this particular piece with words from anyone other than a sufferer who has wrestled with these academic categories. Few fit this bill, but one really stands out, who is Nicholas Walterstorff, who lost his 25-year-old son to a climbing accident, but he comments in his wonderful book, which I highly commend to you, called Lament for a Son. He says, quote, "I have no explanation. I can do nothing else than endure in the face of this deepest and most painful of mysteries. I believe in God the Father Almighty, maker of heaven and earth and resurrector of Jesus Christ. I also believe that my son's life was cut off in its prime. I cannot fit these pieces together. I am at a loss. I have read the Theodicies produced to justify the ways of God to man. I find them unconvincing. To the most agonized question I have ever asked, I do not know the answer. I do not know why God would watch him fall. I do not know why God would watch me wounded. I cannot even guess. To the why of suffering, we get no firm answer. Of course, some suffering is easily seen to be the result of our sin. War, assault, poverty, amidst plenty, the hurt world, or the hurtful word, and maybe some is chastisement, but not all. The meaning of the remainder is not told to us. It eludes us. Our net of meaning is too small. There is more to our suffering than our guilt."